sorry.
Okay. My name is Sidney Goldman, representing the Stanford Jewish Historical Society, and that's where this interview is being held. Our veteran today is Hank Silverstein, and he was born October 2nd, 1938.
October 12th.
October 12th, okay. He served in the Army. His highest rank was sergeant. Helping with this interview are Marcie Schoenfeld, Leah Tillman, and Elisa Kaplan.
Okay.
Are we ready? Okay. Hank, I'm going to ask you some questions here, and feel free to, tell us how you feel about them. Give us a little bit of your biography, where you were born, where you grew up, went to school, and so forth.
So I was born in Brooklyn, New York, as you said before, October 12th, 1938. I lived most of my life in the Gravesend section of Brooklyn, which includes Coney Island, Sheepshead Bay, Gravesend proper, Bensonhurst. And my primary address was 1901 Ocean Parkway, which is currently the Sephardic Jewish Center, but then was an apartment house. I went to Abraham Lincoln High School. I graduated from New York University with a degree in Bachelor of Science, actually a Bachelor of Arts in Education, Science Education, Specialty Geology. In 1960, I received a master's degree from City College in Earth Science Education in '66.
Tell us a little bit about your family, where they were from when they were here, what occupations they had, something about your siblings, if you have anything. And
Okay, I have three brothers. An older brother who was a retired school teacher, which is what I am, a retired New York City school teacher. I have a younger brother who served 20 years in the Navy, mostly on aircraft carriers and 3 tours of duty in Vietnam. And I have a baby brother who just recently retired as a senior government economist, Washington, D.C. My father was a manager and part owner in a hardware firm of 36 stores in New York City and its suburbs. My mother was a homemaker. My father's family came from Belarus and Poland, my mother's family from Romania, and I think that about covers the family, doesn't it?
were your parents born here or overseas?
My parents were born here, yes.
Okay. And what were the circumstances when you went into the Army? Tell us about that and then what you did there.
Okay. I was a science teacher in junior high school, which meant I had a deferment. But I also was a union organizer when the union was first starting. And being a union organizer, I wasn't very popular with the principal. And I had taken the regular teaching exam, and part of the regular teaching exam was the principal's review of record. And he rated me a failing mark in order to punish me. Called up my draft board and told me that as of July 31st, my deferment will be ended and I should be drafted on August 1st. Did I answer your question?
And what year was that?
That was 1962. So I immediately called up a friend of mine who was in the Army Reserves, who was a medic, and I said, do you know any unit that has any opening in the reserves? Because at nearly 24 years old, I didn't want to spend 2 years in the reserve as a draftee. And he said there was a unit just coming back from Berlin. They were called up for the Berlin crisis. They're going to have a lot of openings. He says, do you want to know what kind of unit it is? And I said, I couldn't care less. And I called the contact number. The next day I went there, I signed my papers and found out it was a chemical decontamination unit.
Tell us what that is, chemical decontamination unit.
It's actually a combination depot unit and decontamination. Our job was to go into areas where poison gases and biological weapons were stored and to make sure they weren't leaking, and if they were, to decontaminate them. The duty was very hazardous, and we were very well trained, but it didn't mean that there were times when we unfortunate exposure to certain things like Agent Orange.
Now, you were a Brooklyn boy, and you went into basic training where? And tell us a little bit about that transition from being a city boy into basic
Remember,
training.
I was 2 weeks away from my 24th birthday, so in Army terms, I was already an old man when I went in with a lot of experience. I wasn't an 18-year-old kid. I went to Fort Dix, New Jersey for my basic training and my advanced individual training, which took a period of 6 months. Basic training was particularly difficult for me because of my age compared to 18-year-olds. And the fact is that the equipment that it was peacetime, 62. Officially, the Vietnam War started in January of 1962, but it really didn't heat up until the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964, so I was in a peacetime army. Thus, our equipment and basic training was totally inadequate. I had a Korean War vintage M1 rifle with a crooked barrel, which meant that any time I aimed at a target, the bullet would go to the right. And we had hand grenades that wouldn't go off, and gas masks that were ineffective. But that was one of the interesting things about basic training. One more thing in basic training. Because I found it very difficult keeping up with the youngsters, the sergeants, who are actually closer in age to me than they were to the kids, they really treated me very well and very fairly. When we went on our 15-mile marches, if I walked in the soft earth along the side of the road, they never yelled at me or made me run around the 250-man company. The 18-year-olds, they made walk on the hard concrete and run around the company. So it made it like easier for me, but it didn't make it easy for me.
Well, how was barracks life with all these 18-year-old kids?
Well, I wasn't going to tell the story, but I will tell the story, one that I already told to Sid earlier. There was a tendency on the part of these college freshmen, which is what I used to call them sarcastically, to want to pick on the older guys in the unit who were not as competent as they were. So what I took to doing is I would take my bayonet every night and I would sharpen it, and then after I sharpened it, I would pull a hair from my head and cut the hair, spit on the bayonet, and then put it under my pillow. And they knew to stay away from me because they thought I was nuts. So that's how I managed to survive with the 18 and 19-year-olds that I was serving with. They called me. This is interesting. I was known as Grandpa. I was known as Professor because I was a teacher. I was known as the Old Man, etc., etc.
Now, when you completed basic at Fort Dix, where did you go?
I stayed at Fort Dix, and my MOS at that time was file clerk, so I worked in an office, mostly with civilians, filing, and still eating as if I was in basic training. I have to just mention this, that when I finished basic training, I weighed 131 pounds of lean, mean machine. I was in the best shape of my life. And then I had a file clerk job, which means when I got out, 4 months later, I weighed 172 pounds.
Now, you mentioned you were in a decontamination unit.
Yes.
So tell us, how did you get into that? What kind of training you had?
Well, I mentioned how I got into it. I got into it because I wanted to join a unit, and there was an opening. I didn't have any training in decontamination until I actually started going to meetings. Our meetings were held at the 42nd Street Armory on 11th Avenue and 42nd Street, which is now defunct. It's now a 5-star hotel. But when we used to meet there, what they would do is they didn't use any chemical weapons. It was all mock stuff. But we had all kinds of information and tests we had to take on petroleum depots and decontamination. The real training occurred when we went away to summer camp. And the first 2 years that I was in the unit, we went to Pine Bluff, Arkansas.
Summer camp is the reserves you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay.
It was 2 weeks of intensive training. And since we're now talking about My first summer camp was actually in 1963 in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and they were already starting to think seriously about Vietnam. And they hadn't invented the Gulf of Tonkin incident yet, or created it, but they knew that things were happening in Vietnam. And one of our jobs was to load flat cars with these gas containers, these 50-gallon drums of gas that were going to a place called Da Nang, which we had never heard of. We didn't know what Da Nang was. We didn't know where it was going. Included on these, it's more than 20 years since I'm out of the Army, so I can say this. We all had top secret clearance then. We had containers of nerve gas that we were loading on these flat cars, along with CN, which is tear gas, CS, which is choking and vomiting gas, Agent Orange, which you know about, everybody knows about Agent Orange. And we were loading them on these flat cars. And after one summer of doing this, I'm jumping ahead here, I decided I didn't want to do much of that anymore. So when I found out they needed a clerk typist, I went to Fort Hamilton for 6 or 7 months in order to qualify, change my MOS to clerk typist. So that way I'd work in the office instead of having to be out there with those poison gas containers, which, by the way, dated back to World War I. Phosgene, mustard gas, chlorine, and they were rusted and leaking. And it was our job to decontaminate these things when they leaked. And it was very dangerous, very hazardous duty.
Now, this was during your summer.
That was during the first 2 years of summer camp when we were at Pine Bluff. My last 3 summer camps were spent in Fort McClellan, Alabama, which is headquarters chemical warfare units, chemical and biological warfare units east of the Mississippi River. And we were sent there because by this time Vietnam was hot. It was really heated up. And they wanted all the chemical reserve units to be in one place, all together, getting the training they would need if we were sent to Vietnam. The best thing I can say about that is that we were actively doing decontamination work. They would send us into phony Vietnam villages, or that we would set up perimeters, and we had to be prepared to be attacked by an invading force that would shoot chemical weapons at us. You know, they had these drums, small little containers like hand grenades, and you've seen cops do this with tear gas containers. And we never knew what they were going to shoot at us. And we had to be prepared to decontaminate everything they would send to us when we were playing these so-called war games.
Well, when not in summer camp, you were in the reserves. How often did you have to attend?
We met every Wednesday night and one Sunday a month.
And what did you do on those occasions?
Well, again, I was a typist, and then I became, just to jump ahead a little bit, after I became a typist, the one who was the head of administration got out. He was finished with his time, so I became the head of administration. To be in administration, you had to be a non-commissioned officer. So I was promoted first to corporal and then a year later to sergeant. And I was in charge of all administrative services for the unit. That included payroll, morning reports, that included duty roster, anything that had to do with the units, with the paperwork for the unit. I had 4 men that worked for me, and I only answered to the commanding officer. He was my immediate superior. We had in the unit a commanding officer, an executive officer, a first sergeant, a staff sergeant. We had 6 buck sergeants, of which I was one. We had about 12 corporals, and the rest were all privates.
And you were in a demolition unit.
No,
No, pardon me.
God forbid, that's even worse.
Right, okay.
Decontamination.
But during these weekly meetings and Sundays, what training did you get in that specialty?
Well, we had a lot of paperwork, a lot of things to read. We constantly had exams, but it was mostly drilling. Marcie, but not in my case, because I was in the office. So I would have to show up and for the initial roll call, you know, and again, being a sergeant, I had a special position in the unit. And then after a roll call, I would go into the office and do all of the office work, which could never be finished. And, you know, I should have been there 5-6 hours. I mean, we had so much work. That's why I would come about an hour early and stay probably another hour. Instead of 2 hours, I would do about 4 hours in order to get my work done. And in summer camp, I had a lot more work to do, but I had 4 men working for me, and that helped.
Now, during this period of time, what were the possibilities that your unit could have been called to active duty in Vietnam?
They liked to keep us on our toes. They were constantly scaring us. We would get messages that be ready at any time. You can expect to be called up. This especially would occur when we were at Fort McClellan for the last 3 years, because that's when we would have our most intensive training. The only thing is, I knew, since I was the administrative sergeant in the NCO in the unit, I knew that we had the lowest priority on call-up. Why did we have that? Because we were called up for the Berlin crisis. So we already had a call-up before I joined the unit. So I knew that if a unit was going to be called up, it wouldn't be us. Our sister unit was called up, went to Vietnam, and had 90% casualty rate. And probably 100% casualty rate, because when you're exposed to chemicals like they were constantly being exposed to, you tend to get sick and die young and have all kinds of illnesses that we won't even go into here, because I think back to those experiences, something that the military never would admit to. They never would admit Agent Orange, for example, was deadly, until, 15 years ago or something. And the guys in the unit that was called up, our sister unit, they were constantly exposed to these things in Vietnam. And remember, they had these drums of nerve gas. You think they weren't using them against the Viet Cong and against the North Vietnamese? Do you think they weren't?
Well, as you look back at those Army days, what impact did they have on you, positively, negatively, and so forth?
Well, it made me, when I went in, I was, I would say, in the terminology at the time, more or less a hawk. I was, my country right or wrong type of thing. But in my last summer camp, I had a serious bout with ulcerative colitis, which I didn't know I had until then. So they kept me in the hospital overnight, and I had nothing to do, so I walked around in the wards where they had soldiers who had just come back from Vietnam. They would, major injuries. Mostly people who had lost arms, legs, had half their faces shot away, were blind. Terrible injuries, mostly paraplegics. And I walked around there and spoke to the guys and sat with them and talked with them and joked with them. I wrote letters for them, and that immediately changed my view of the Vietnam War. I went from somebody who was in favor to someone who was vehemently opposed to it. By the time I got out in September of 1968, I had become very anti-war. I want to mention something, too, that's very significant about this. In 1965, we would go to our meetings in uniform. Right? We would just go in uniform. And remember, this is 42nd Street, so you get off at the Times Square station, take the bus, or walk if you felt like walking all the way to 11th Avenue. We were notified that we were no longer allowed to wear our uniform in public, because there was a danger that somebody would get us if they saw us in uniform. And so we stopped wearing our uniform. We left the uniforms in the lockers and brought them home, for cleaning. But eventually I started taking my car. I drove my car. I didn't have to take the subway anymore. And we were still told, do not wear your uniform least it was easy to carry it for cleaning and everything because I had my car. So I knew about the unpopularity of the war, and that I could be, there were guys who were beaten up, who actually wound up with people jumping them and getting mugged because they were in uniform. And that happened to men who were actually serving in the regular army, not just reservists. So that was another side to the story. We knew about the unpopularity of the war, but it was 1968 that totally changed my view on the war.
To what extent did you maintain contact, friendships with people you had met in the military subsequently?
For a few years, I kept up with some of the men. But my service in the military, the only way to describe it is, except for some of the funny stories that I remember, I buried a lot of what happened. People talk about not talking about things until later. I will tell you of one incident that occurred that was buried until recently, and that the last summer camp when we were on maneuvers, the captain, who was the only Jewish, by the way, since this is Jewish Historical Society here, my only Jewish officer, who was a great man and a Silver Star winner in Vietnam, knew nothing about chemical warfare. He was infantry, by the way. That didn't matter to the Army, see. But anyway, he decided that we should really get exposure to what it was like in Vietnam, okay? So we were going to go into the rice paddies, and we were going to go into a fake Vietnam village. They had a number of them at Fort McClellan. But in order to get there, we had to cross on a log over a ravine, and it was about a 35-foot drop into white water below. And there was a rope to hold on to, and the captain, who was 6'5", he went across like that, and I looked at him and I said to him, all 5'5" of me, I'm a sergeant, right? Okay, I'm next. I go ahead, I grab the rope, I get to the middle of the log, there's no more rope. I couldn't reach the rope anymore. I froze. I absolutely froze. So Captain Ornstein, who was a really good man, very smart man, he starts walking towards me and talking about my wife, my kids, and my job, you know, and I'm thinking to myself, don't look down, don't look down. Who's going to come to my funeral? This is what I'm thinking. We had a private in the unit who was a New York City motorcycle cop and an expert in saving people's lives. I didn't know this. He was walking on the log on the other side. I was not facing him, so I didn't know this. His name was Kevin Waterman. And the next thing I know, I'm in a fight. He grabs me. He was 6'5" himself. Puts me in a fireman's carry, carries me to the other side, dumps me on the ground, and the commanding officer says, take Sergeant Hank to the NCO club and get him drunk. And that was an incident which I didn't remember. You know, it was buried in my subconscious until a few years ago. And then I had some nightmares about it, and I shouldn't be here now. You know, people think that you're in the reserves and you're in training and you're not in Vietnam and it's safe, right? Well, we were dealing with deadly chemical and biological weapons all the time, and we had incidents like I described. You know, in basic training, sometimes hand grenades would go off in people's hands when they were throwing them. So, you know, if you're in the military, it doesn't matter what you're in. Your life is at risk at all times. It's like being a cop, you know, your life's at risk at all times. And that incident, that one incident, which, as again, I said I finally remembered, I actually had the courage to tell that story 2 weeks ago to my brother Steve, who was the one who was 20 years in the Navy. And he was dumbfounded. He was so silent when he heard that incident.
When you went into the service, you were married already?
I was married with 2 kids. I had a job. I had just taken my regular teaching exam, and you heard that other story. Eventually, by the way, I went for a hearing at the Board of Education and was absolved. I won my case and got my regular teaching exam. So when I got out in 1963, I started teaching in junior high school as a regular teacher for 4 years before I went to high school. First Sheepshead Bay High School for 6 years, then Beach Channel High School in Rockaway for 17 years. I was the creator of the first physical oceanography curriculum in the city of New York. And I went to Beach Channel High School because they were an oceanography school, and I had an opportunity to teach my subject, which I loved doing, anything to do with oceanography, geology, meteorology, that I really enjoyed.
Any of your children serve in the military subsequently?
No, my children did not serve in the military, and I wouldn't discourage them if they wanted to. I have a grandchild who's 15 now who thinks he'd like to serve in the military. I don't know if he will or not. But remember, we're at a time where it's all volunteer army now, all volunteer military. When I was in, and when you were in, Sid, there was a draft. So you had a totally different set of circumstances than you have now. And I think most middle-class kids do not have, as they call it, to serve in the military. I think today a lot of people who serve in the military are looking to make a living. They want to have food and clothing and some money, and they can't get a job because of the way things are right now.
Now you belong to the Stanford chapter of Jewish War Veterans, and tell us about your activities there and what it's like with all these other veterans.
Very little. I don't. It reminds me too much of actually being in the military again, which I try to forget about. In that you start out with the salute to the flag and the Pledge of Allegiance and attention and all this kind of stuff. When I got out in 1968, I was done with that. That was a part of my life that I was finished with. I find it to be, it's too militaristic for me. I don't enjoy it. But I'm also an active member of the Retired Men's Club that meets on Monday at the JCC, and there are a lot of World War II veterans there. And I must tell you this story because it's very important, especially for this history thing. I had read a book, and the name of the book was Why Is There No World War II Poetry? It was written by the grandson of a man, he was a poet, this guy, who was shot down during World War II. He was a pilot in a Lancaster bomber who went on 85 missions, and he was shot down on his 85th mission and died. He never knew his grandfather. But World War I is very famous for great poetry. They were wonderful poets that wrote about their experiences in the trenches on all sides. But there was really no poetry from World War II. So I thought about this, and I started interviewing guys who were in the club, who were World War II veterans. And I started writing poems about their stories. I have now written 24 poems. I've expanded now. I now have, I have one poem about a World War I veteran who I never met, who's dead, of course. And I also have a Vietnam poem. And, but the generation, the World War II generation, the greatest generation, they're dying. I mean, they're in their late 80s and 90s, and I'm so glad I'm having the opportunity to write these poems about them. They're all done in iambic pentameter. Only one of them is a rhyming poem, so they're all free verse. And they're in the words of the person. And most of them are the person's, they're I, it's first person singular. And I think that that's something very important that Jewish Historical Society should be aware of, that I'm doing this project on my own and will continue with. Eventually I intend to publish it. Vanity Press, because nobody publishes poetry anymore. So I'll find a Vanity Press person to publish it, and the stories of these guys who are dying. People should know what happened to them, and very importantly, what should know that Jews were not shirkers. Jews have served in every war. Jews have gotten medals of honor, silver stars, all kinds of things. And we should be proud of the service that we had. I may have hated war by 1968, but I'm very proud of my service in the military. I'm very proud to serve my country. And I don't have any other questions.
Well, Hank, you know, this interview goes into the archives of the Library of Congress, and maybe 100 years from now, someone's going to be doing some research. To conclude this interview, is there some sort of message you want to leave for our answer, you know, the people yet to come?
Well, I think that I just gave my message. That I'm a proud Jew, and I was proud to serve my country. And hopefully, we'll never have to send people off to war and to get killed again. To me, that's the message that I would like to keep. That we shouldn't. There ain't going to be war no more.
Is there something we could put in a category you'd like to add to, like life lessons coming from your military service?
Life lessons? You know, people will say, oh, they grew up, they became men, or nowadays women. How that fits in. But life lessons? What stinks? You want a life lesson? I would use a stronger word, but I'm on camera. And if this is going into the archives of the National Archives of some kind, I'll just use the mild term "war stinks." And I would like to see no more war. This is a very strong feeling that I have. That you can grow up and you can become an adult and you can become a mature human being and a good human being without having to go through the horrors of war. It's not necessary. And I'd like to see war end somehow, but I know I'm a realist. I know it's not going to happen. And we have to keep a strong enough military in this country. And that's a message to people to understand. I'm very much in favor of that. We need that. Because we have a lot of enemies, and we need to protect our country.
Well, Hank, we thank you for participating.
Excuse me for rubbing my nose.
It's been very interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.